In this tutorial we're going to go over how to set up some UVs for an object inside Maya, export it, then import it into Mudbox, paint some textures on from photo references, then re-export the textures and import them back into Maya. So what we've got here is a bone provided by the University of Bradford's archaeology department, and this is a bone that's been infected with leprosy. So a few things we have to take into account is what we're actually scanning. So if we're doing something like a game prop, there's different rules that will apply. The UVs they won't have to be perfect, and the texturing, we've got some sort of artistic license. But for something like for the archaeology department, we want these UVs to be as efficient as possible. We want to get the UVs as efficient so we can get the textures in the right place. So areas where these bones have decayed due to leprosy, we want to take that into consideration. And also when painting the textures in Mudbox, we don't want to just paint the textures to make it look like a bone. We want those textures to match up, so this seam, this crease here, we want that to match up, and any damage that we'll see around these areas we want to match up, because this is going to be used as a reference. So we want the actual model and the textures to look like the real thing. So to start off with, what I'll do is, we want this bone in the centre of the grid, so when it's been scanned it's not aligned to the centre of Maya. So what we'll do is we'll centre the pivot on that bone, then snap it to the middle of the grid. Now the reason I'm doing this is it's always good to have it in the centre of the grid for mapping purposes. If we do a cylindrical map, we know it's going to rotate around this centre point. And also when we import into Mudbox, if it's over here in the corner somewhere, it'll be harder to texture and also rotate in the camera. It's easier to rotate it around a centre point, so for this we're going to use the grid. So we can do stuff like go into the top view. I'm just going to align this along. So the reason I'm aligning this is for things like if I do a cylindrical map, we're obviously going to be, it's going to be easier if we're doing it down the x-axis, so it goes straight along. If this is some sort of angle, it's going to do a cylindrical map down the x-axis at an angle, and we'll have to realign that. So it just speeds up production, and also once inside Mudbox it'll help as well. And then we'll do the same again in the front view, and I'll just centre this up. Okay, so now that we've centred the actual bone, what we'll be wanting to do is figure out what sort of UV shells we're going to be doing. So as I said earlier, because this is going to be an accurate representation of the scan, we're going to have to make these UVs as stretchless as possible. And often that means in some areas like here, there's not going to be a particularly good area for UV. And if this was a game prop again, we could just project and then unfold that UV in, but that would cause some stretching around these areas in these creases here and along these decaying parts. So what we'll have to do is actually separate this section here and this section up here into different UV sets, and that way we can avoid the actual stretching. So in this tutorial I'm just going to show you how to UV a few parts, and then I'll go ahead and just do the rest of the UVing, because after a while it'll be the pretty much same procedure once you know how to do it. So for this centre bit along the middle of this long bone here, what I want to do is something like a cylindrical map, because it's quite uniform apart from this little hole, but which won't give us too much problems. So we can get away with most of the UV for the middle just as a cylindrical map. So what I'll do is go into faces by right clicking and go into face, and then I'll probably go into the front view to get the best view. And what I'm going to do is select quite a large area of this cylinder, and what I'll then do is in perspective mode I'm going to go and have a look at what I've actually selected. So I've selected the most of the centre, which is quite smooth, there's no decay or little holes or anything like that. So I'm checking along this edge, it's quite okay. There's a little dimple here, but that doesn't matter too much, because it's mainly holes sort of like this. There's not too many on this bone, but definitely along here you get all these big crevices, and on some of the bones there's quite large holes that go inside the mesh and come back out, and those are the holes, that we want to look out for, because if we had a hole here that went inside, textured that and then unpacked it, what Maya would do to unpack that hole is sort of flatten it, and that'll stretch the texture around this area. The UVs around this area will have to compensate because of that hole, because it's trying to flatten the texture out. So if we come along to this side, we've got a few more holes, and then along here we can see there's one of these crevices. So what I'll actually do along this side is, if I hold Control and then select an area, I'm going to mark out and deselect that area. So we want this cylindrical, this is quite smooth, we want that separate to these holes here. And then I'll do the same. So I'll do the same along here, select that area, deselect that area. So we'll do that separately. And then I'll check along the bottom, deselect that. Around this side it's quite smooth. Might just select to get these crevices away. And then I'll just even it off. So there's this part sticking out here, so I'll just even the text, the UVs along there. The face is selected. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. So what we'll do at this stage is go to Create UVs and Cylindrical Mapping. Now usually for this job I'd have two screens set up so you can see the UVs whilst editing it in the 3D space. But for this tutorial what I'll have to do is I'll shrink down the window here so you can actually see what's happening. So I'd recommend if you've got some sort of dual monitor setup, you'd have this on a separate monitor so you can check what's happening at the same time. Now as you can see, what's this doing is it's projecting a cylinder from this little cube here, so from this direction, and then it's wrapping it around, but you can see it's wrapping it around the wrong direction. We want it along the x-axis. So you can do that in the options, so when you go to create cylindrical mapping you can usually change which axis you want, I think. But for this what we're going to do is click on this little red icon here to bring up the manipulator, and then we're going to select the circle around the manipulator, which brings up the rotate tool. And what we can then do is change the rotation of this projection. And as you can see, as we're doing that, it's also updating in the UV window. So what we want to do is we want to do this at the same time, look at them both, and we can see that that's quite a good setting up the UVs quite well. And what you can also see is over here it's got a slight selection here, so this is what I've not deselected earlier, and you can see that over here, this little orange line. So these orange lines are the seams, so the edge of the UVs. So that's something I've forgot to deselect, so I'll just ignore that at the moment, and later on we'll just move it to the side, and when we UV something around this section we'll include that. Okay, so that's looking quite good at the moment. So we've got those UVs set up, and we can see that it's projecting them the right way. So what I'll then do is go back into object mode. We've got them set up, but what you'll notice is it won't be 100% will this. It looks fine at the moment, but we want to unpack some of this because we did do a cylindrical map, but we want to unpack it because some areas like these are raised up and this is a slight indentation. When this maps it, it basically does a cylindrical map all the way around, and it looks at this from this angle and just flattens it out, which is works quite well for the rest of the bone because the bone is quite flat and quite smooth. But for like these little dints along here, we want to unwrap the UVs. So to do that, we've got a few tools. Now, as I said earlier, this is a slight error. I shouldn't have selected these, so we'll just move these to the side. Right, so with these UVs selected, what it's called is a UV shell. And what you can also do is, if you've got a few selected, you can control and right click to shell. And that's to show that we've got one shell. So what we'll need to do is unpack this. So what we can do is, there's this smooth UV tool up here. You can go to polygons, smooth UVs, or use this little tool icon here, and that will bring up this little box down here that's unfold and relax. Now relax is sort of relaxes UVs and makes them close together. And for this job we don't want that, because that takes away what its 3D representation in this 3D view. It sort of relaxes them, but it doesn't relax them related to their actual world space. It just evens them out. Now the unfold, we'll be using the unfold mainly for this project. So if you click on the unfold text and you left click and hold and drag, as you can see that's unfolding the UVs. And as this is quite a high poly count model, it's going to lag quite a bit. So best thing to do is just wait and don't click or frustratedly click, because that'll probably crash and then you'll have to restart. But as you can see, as we are unfolding it, you can see we have a straight line where the cylindrical map basically mapped it as a cylinder. But as you can see now we're unwrapping it, all these little crevices will get unwrapped, so that increases the space. But it evens out the texture on the actual bone, so this creates this sort of shape. Okay, so we can take a look at that and it's looking alright. One thing you'll want to watch out for if you do use the unwrap, is if you click unwrap and it totally flips out, this all screws up, and sometimes there's like small faces and there's massive faces. Because on this scanned model you can see it's got a lot of faces, but it's quite uniform. The triangles, there's small triangles and bigger triangles, but they're all pretty much the same size. So when looking in the UVs, this should be consistent. If you've got a few triangles and then one massive triangle, obviously there's going to be a problem, because that massive triangle in 3D space is actually still a small triangle. So the other tool that we're going to use is, if we select the UVs again, is the unfold selected UVs, which is similar to the smooth UVs, the unfold. Basically the only difference is when we're unfolding here, we're clicking and dragging and telling the amount we want to unfold it by. If we use the unfold command, that's a preset command that unfolds it by a preset amount of times, and sometimes that can come into problems. If we use that, click unfold, it'll have something like a preset of 15 attempts to unfold, and that might go beyond the threshold. It might go past this sort of UVs that we like. This is unfolded to a level we like, and it might unfold it even more, and that's when you get into the errors where there's like small little pockets of triangles and big massive geometry over here, which we don't want. So I'm just going to try and fold it a little bit more so we can see it unfolding more. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that at the moment. So I'll move this to one side, and once you've set up UVs, what you can do, I won't do it on this model in particular because it's high resolution, it tends to lag quite a bit. But one thing you can do is, if you assign a checkered texture to your model and then go to render high quality rendering, so you can see the checkered quite smooth and quite defined, is if you have a checkered texture on your object and it's obviously square checkered, then that should be the same inside your 3D view. You should be able to see the square checkered. If they're rectangular checkered, that means there's something wrong with UVs. So for example, if our UVs were stretched like this, now to the untrained eye you might look at that and think, yeah, that looks alright, it's like that's a cylinder and that's the same shape as that. But in actual fact it's stretched, and if you put the checkered texture on it, you'd be able to see the actual checkered pattern would be stretched. Okay, and another tip is, if I select like a rectangle along here, what I'll be checking is, in this 3D view I'll be checking the consistency of these selected UVs. Now it doesn't matter if the UVs at this side don't match perfectly at this side, because when we unpacked, the actual ends, these seams, won't match up, but they'll match up when we texture. It just means that when we actually select these edges over here will be the same edges over here, but they might not match up if we just select a straight rectangle, sorry. So if we select this rectangle, what I'm looking for is to check if the thickness of this rectangle is consistent. And what that will usually cause problems with is if you get a really small thickness over here and then a really massive thickness over here, but in the UV it's consistent, that means that again the UVs are being stretched in a certain area. Okay, and another thing we'll use is this icon up here, which puts on, oh wait, it's along here, sorry. It's a little square and another little blue square. So if we click that, what this does is it brings up sort of the occlusion of the object, if you want. So this sort of light shade blue, this is normal. This is what we want. This means there's no UVs underneath it and there's no overlapping and it's the right way around. This is what we want, this sort of nice casual blue. So we'll check along the edges, and as you can see it's all the same, it's all quite nice. But then we get to an area here. Now I picked this up a few earlier whilst checking the UVs. When selecting the rectangle I can see a nice rectangle, but then it sort of comes to a point over here. So again, checking that with this occlusion sort of blue thing on, I can see that it's a darker blue here, and what that tells me is this dark blue means there's this type of blue on top of itself again. So this means that over here there's UVs on top of each other, and for some things that don't matter a lot, for in animation or games too much if you're not too fussed about that, but for this again we'll be painting on photo reference textures. So if we painted on, for instance, following this seam down, if we painted a texture along here and all along here, it then, because they're in the same place, you can only apply one texture and it'll get duplicated to two parts of the mesh. And again, that's going to cause problems because you've got the same texture in two places and then you can never have the correct texture on them. So we need the UV space to be separate. So what we can do is select these UVs in this area and then just unpack that section and try and unfold it manually. Now sometimes what we'll actually get is there isn't a solution, we can't unfold this, and we don't want to unfold this to a state where it stretches UVs. I could manually select these UVs over here and pull them over and then align these, and so it's all not occluding each other, but that would stretch the actual UVs we've got there. So sometimes there isn't a solution, and what we'll have to actually do is select these faces along here. So I'll select the UVs of the problemed area, and as you can see it's this area over here that's overlapping. And what I will actually do is go back into face selection mode and select this area. And then again, there's some areas over here I don't really want, so I'll deselect them. I'll go into wireframe mode by pressing 4 just to check that there's no other areas, so there's some faces over here, so I'll deselect them as well. Okay, so deselecting more areas. Right, so we've got this area selected, the area where it's occluded over here. So with these faces now, what we're going to do is project another set of UVs, so project from another angle, and then set up a separate shell. So from this I've got it on my shelf, which is create UVs based on camera angle, and for doing these bones I've found this quite useful. Basically it's going to project from wherever your camera angle is facing. So for this I'm going to try and get an angle where I can see the majority of these faces without them being occluded with each other. So I don't want this angle because it's occluding these faces up here, so I'm going to get this sort of angle here. Create UVs based on camera, or I'm going to use this shelf icon I've made here, and as you can see that's made it So that looks pretty much the same as that camera angle. So with these selected, I'm going to go to UV by right clicking and dragging to UV, and I'm going to select some UVs on it, then again control and right click to shell. So that's now the UV shell of the faces we've just selected. And again, because we did it based on the camera angle, it's obviously straight on from this camera angle, but then when we move the camera we can see this selection here is quite large, but from this camera angle it's quite small, so there's going to be some stretching going on. So again, what we'll have to do is select it and unfold these UVs again. So now you can see that it's unfolded. We can see this bottom shape here, and then curling around to this top is making this shape. So we can tell that that's sort of quite looking the same, and we'll just unfold it a few more times. Okay, so also what I'm doing is going right click and going to face and selecting a random face. Oh, also a thing to note is whilst in this smooth UV tool you can't select faces or edges, only UVs. So remember, go back to your selection tool and then we can select a face. So just select one random face and that'll get rid of the wireframe, so then I can check the colour of the UVs, see if they're occluding each other. Now you can see it's happening in here again, so that's another problem we'll have to sort out. But you can see it's the UVs that we've taken here has taken that chunk out here. So now this area is sort of cleaning up again. And then again we'll check down here, there's some more occlusion happening here, so we'll just unwrap that area. And usually you can unwrap an area quite well, but it's not happening this time. So we can see there's a small area there. So what we'll then do is repeat what we've done over here, take that little chunk out there and then UV it. And what we'll actually probably do is, because we have an occlusion here and an occlusion here, what we'll actually probably do later on is take out this entire top section of the UVs and create that as a separate shell. Okay, so as you can see we've got these here again. So we'll try and unfold these. And as you can see, it's not doing it again. Unfolding is just creating more of an occlusion. So what we'll probably have to do is these sections themselves will have to UV separately. So I'll probably select some more faces, and we'll UV that part separately. So this is where, coming into, as I explained at the start of the tutorial, creating different shells. That's the importance of creating shells, because if I just left this as one giant shell, we'd have this occlusion here. But as you saw, we had two occlusions, one over here, which we got from there, and this small occlusion down here. And this is from the part of the bone which is quite smooth. So that's the smoothest part of the bone, and we're getting an occlusion. So when you get to these areas of the bone, where there's these big massive holes and all this grittiness, the occlusion gets a bigger problem. So what we'll have to actually do for these areas is select this section here. That'd be one shell. This backside is quite smooth, so we'll select that section of shell, and that'd be one UV shell. And again, with this top part, we'd select that, and that'd be another smooth part. So what I'll show you here is how we'll do this face here, this section here, and adding on that these grittiness bits. So what I'll do for this area, first off I'll just move these UVs to one side. What I would do for this is start off, get an angle like from above, go into face selection mode and just drag a selection around there. So that'll select these faces, and then again holding control and dragging a selection, I'll deselect these bottom parts and parts we don't want. And the reason why I'm deselecting these parts is because we don't want too many angles for one UV set. If I project UVs from this angle, and then there's these coming round here, if I'm to unfold that, then these faces along the edge around here and around the top, they'd have to sort of fold over, and that would cause some stretching as well. So we want to avoid that. So deselecting these faces. And it doesn't matter too much if there's some faces coming around the corner, that's fine. It's only when you get big areas. Okay, so we've... Ooh, still lagging a bit. Okay, so we've got the faces we want. Let's deselect these. Now, so with that, what we'll then do is project from a camera angle again. So, because it's quite flat on, we'll, with them selected, project from camera. And that's created those UVs again. And again, because we've projected from camera, some areas are going to be stretched, so we'll unwrap that to unstretch them. Okay, that's looking quite nice, and that's the same shape as that. And then what we'll do is, again, select another section. So I'll select this top flat bit, deselect the parts we don't want, and a lot of this I'm going over quite quickly to show you in the tutorial, but usually while selecting these faces we'll go over quite, if you're doing this outside your tutorial, we'll probably zoom in and individually select some of these faces, like these triangles here, would reselect them to make it a smoother edge. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going over it quite quickly. Okay, so, and also in here, I'll deselect these, because these are already faces selected along here that we've already set UVs for, so we don't want to cut these off this shell, so I'll deselect them again. And then we'll project from this angle and create another UV set. And with these UVs selected, unwrap them. We'll give that a moment. So we've got two shells now. And then finally, quite quickly, I'll just do a quick selection of these faces around here. Again, I'm just doing a quick collection for the purposes of the tutorial. What I would have done is selected and probably selected around the seams of these knobbly bits, and same for like this hole, selected around there instead of cutting straight through the middle. And then I'll just quickly deselect that top bit, and then the UVs for the shell, the faces for this shell will deselect again. And also you want to avoid, say like if we've got this angle, this big nice UV set here, you also want to avoid little thin bits coming off here. Some cases you can't help but avoid it, but it's better to say like attach these faces to this shell here instead of having it coming off the side of one. Okay, so with them selected again, we'll do UVs based on camera. And I'm doing UVs based on camera for a lot of these because if you did a planar mapping, Maya by default does it along some sort of like x-axis or down this angle, so you'd have to manually realign that, and that takes up more time, where you can just quickly select an angle and get your UVs straight away. And then we'll unwrap these again. Now you can see it's taking a bit more time unwrapping because this is a UV shell with all these little knobbly bits. And as you can see, as I said earlier, what sometimes happens is we get a big massive triangle. And if I select the face of this triangle and then pressing F in 3D view to frame up on it, move this to the side, as you can see, it isn't a big triangle. It's actually the same as every other triangle, but when we've unwrapped it, there's been an error whilst unwrapping it, because there's so many like dimples and holes in this section that it can't quite figure out how to unwrap it, so it creates a big massive triangle. And then over in this section you can see, as we said, the triangles are quite consistent. Over here they're quite consistent, but over here we get these absolutely tiny triangles in comparison. So texture wise that would mean the textures over here are fine, but as soon as we start painting textures towards here it gets really, really small. And what it means by small is textures are in essence just pictures, so that's pixels. So triangles over here get so many pixels space depending on your resolution of your texture. So as we get further and further to these areas, that means less pixels are assigned to these areas. So that means they're going to get stretched, and as this is an important part of this, because this is looking into the effects of leprosy, we want to preserve these areas, and these are the areas that we need the textures for. And if this area is just basically these tiny triangles over here, then we're not going to get a good texture result, so we'll have to amend that. So I'll just undo a few steps back. So that's a problem from using the automated version. So when it comes to this case like this, we'll have to manually do it. So we'll use the unfold command, and in this case we can see this is doing quite a good job in itself. So this is just unfolding it a few times and not over unfolding it. And again, selecting like a rectangle, we can see in the 3D view this rectangle isn't getting any thinner or thicker in any parts, so that's staying quite consistent. So as I said, with the pixels of the texture, the size over here is the same over here, so that's quite a good result. Also can select a square and then check out what that looks like over here. So we selected a square, and over here it's pretty much square as well. If this was a rectangle or a circle, that would mean there's a problem. But as a square, and it's looking quite good, we can see that that's not going to give us too much of a problem. So what we can also do is, we've got two shells. So this shell over here, this bottom shell, and another shell over here. And these shells are quite smooth, so what we can actually do is, the thing about shells is it means there's going to be a lot of seams, and that's not too bad if your textures are UVs are quite well, because that means in Mudbox you can paint over the seams and you won't be able to tell. But it's always a good practice to reduce the amount of seams as possible, because it also means when aligning these we can align them better. There's not too many gaps. If we were to set up all the UVs in the end up, we'd have all these little gaps in between the UV shells. So if we just stitch some UV shells together, we can avoid wasting space, and that'll mean we have more space to actually paint the textures on. So what I'll do is select the UVs in this area over here where the two shells meet, and we can see that matching these up by eye, you can see that this gap here might be this gap here. So we can select the edges, and because this face here will be next to a face over here, they'll be sharing the same edge. This is the way that UVs work, is that there'll be separate UV shells, but the edges will be shared. So if I select an edge over here, the selection makes it orange, but you can also see it selects an edge over here, because in the 3D space there is only one edge, which is over here, but because the shells are separated and the seam runs along that edge, that's why we're getting two edges in the UV view. So what we can do is just select a few edges over here. We can see that's matching those up. And one thing before we actually stitch these together is that we'll notice the size of this UV shell is much bigger than this UV shell over here. But in the UV texture editor, the top shell is bigger than the bottom. So that means this texture here will be larger than this texture over here. So what we want to do is we'll scale this down to match the sizes. And a good way to try and match the sizes is, again, if we select we just get the UVs aligned and select a rectangle, we can see that this selection here matches this up because we scaled it down. So we can see this is a little bit smaller, so we can then rescale these. But now that we've resized it, it's looking quite the same. So with them the same size, now these edges match up a bit better. So selecting the edges again, and I'll select a few more edges down here. So with those edges selected, what I'll then do is use the stitch command, so move and saw command. So what this will do is move these two UV shells together, and where the edges are the same edges, it'll stitch them back together. So I'll just do that. Now that's looking quite good at the moment. It's moved them together and stitched them, and because these are quite seamless, so to say, there's no dints, no holes along this edge which we stitched together, it's worked quite well. But sometimes you might get some occlusion, some stretching again. So what we'll do is, as it's stitched them together, it hasn't unpacked them. What we'll do again is select the UVs and run an unfold command again. And as you'll notice, these will pop out a bit. So you saw them shift a bit. So they're shifting to the new seam. So it's compensating the UVs round in that section and unfolding them again. So now we can see, if we select a square, that again it's looking quite nice. I selected a square here, and you can see that that's one angle, one edge corner of the square, and coming along that's the other. So we can see there's no stretching going on, and that's looking quite well. So in this case we've had made two shells, but we've stitched them together to make one, which has worked out quite well. But in some cases, if I was then to try and stitch on this area over here, that might work, but we don't want to stitch too many shells together, because I've experienced this in previous bones that I've done, that if we UV'd this shell here, this set of faces up here, we could then stitch them on there, and then if we selected these UVs here and stitched them on, it might look fine, but then it starts to stretch it, because in essence this UV shell here is flat, the top one's flat, and they're joined by a single angle sort of thing, so it's sort of folding a piece of paper over. If we then added this section here and this section up here, you're adding more parts, and especially if we added those parts there, it's not folding in one plane. So we'd have this here, have a plane there, but then when it starts to stretch on this area, we'll get some stretching. So it's better to have separate UV shells, because if you try and stitch it all together, it might look pretty in the UV texture editor, but essentially doing that is going to cause some stretching, and it might not cause great amounts of stretching, but the more and more you add, the more and more the stretching will add up. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do before I speed on ahead is, with this UV shell selected, I'm going to just put it next to the previous UVs we did, and again select a rectangle of them both. Now I'm just doing this because when you do the UVs, you want all the UV shells to be consistently the same size. So for instance, if we were messing about with these UVs and they came up this size, now you might be looking at it and think, yeah, that's about the right size, and compared to that bone, yeah, that looks fine. But if then we select a rectangle, we can see that, I'll just select a bigger one, you can see that the actual thickness of them won't match up. Again, if we were doing this and this was a lot smaller and we selected the UVs, you can see again this is a nice thin consistent line, but the thickness of this line isn't the same as this, even though when we selected them in the UV texture editor they were the same. So this is a sign that this texture is too small, and the general rule is if it's thicker, it means the UV shell's too small. So what we'll then do is scale this up, and then reselect another line, and check that out again. So looking at these, this still looks quite big, so because it's big here, we'll have to scale it up a bit more. And then finally, this is starting to look a bit better. The thickness of the UVs over here is matching these UVs more. So the reason we're doing that again is just to, when we texture it, the texture of this wants to be the same size as this. So it's just matching the UVs up so the texture size for the entire bone is consistent. And it might not matter if one texture is bigger over here than a texture over here because they're not connected. But when we get into painting on shells that are next to each other, so as you can see, we UV'd this section separately. If this texture here was too big compared to this texture, then we'd get an obvious seam, because Mudbox wouldn't be able to paint across this seam, because this is a large. If this was a massive texture and this was really small, it wouldn't be able to paint across. So we want to keep these the relative texture space between these the same. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause the tutorial and come back when I've finished UVing the entire UVs of this bone, and I'll come back and show you how to lay them out properly. Okay, so now that I've got all the UV shells set out, before I arrange them, what I'll need to do is, if you just select one of the faces just to get rid of the wireframe, and again check this bluish colour and check each of the shells for anything we might have missed. So we're just checking to see if any slight discoloration. So here you can see there's a red and another sort of red, and that means there's a triangle. So there's a few faces that are either a part of this shell, or there might be a separate shell underneath this shell. And the red usually indicates that the actual UVs are the wrong way around, so the normals will be facing the wrong way. So it's painting it on the wrong side if you're going to paint it. So what we'll need to do is we'll select this face. So for this one we can see it's actually still part of this shell. So it's just something where it's been overlapping like that. So we can easily just move it back over, or a better thing to do is select a few of the UVs in that area and just do another unfold. And we can see it's gone back over again. So maybe that's like on the actual mesh, that's part of the triangle sticking out, and we can't really get a good enough thing, and there's no point making a single shell just for something so small. So what we'll do is we'll just move it across, and it'll stretch the texture slightly, but not too much to be that much noticeable, and the textures won't be that high resolution in this area to tell any difference anyway. So the next one was down here. We can see again that's the same problem, so we'll just move this along, and maybe this one give that triangle some more space. And it's important to do this at this stage, because if you do it later down on the line you won't be able to do it in Mudbox. If you have problems like this and you start painting texture and then realise after you've painted the texture you can't come back into Maya and change it, that'll change what you've done in Mudbox and you'd have to repaint it. For something as small as this, so you'd be able to get around it, but it's just a good workflow to just do it now. So I'm going to pause the video here again and just go through all these little things and then arrange the UV shells into a more manageable and get it within the texture square up here. Okay, so now I've gone through all the faces, checking where there might be some UV problems and sorted them out. So now we've got all the shells together, and I've checked the sizes of the shells with each other, so they're all the relative same size, so the texture's going to be fine. Now all we need to do is fit all these UV shells inside this square here, which represents your texture. Now it's a good idea to have square textures. You can have rectangle textures if you want, but it's always best to keep square textures, because in Maya the UVs are going to take it as a square, and you have to go fiddling about with the UV placements if you want it and change to have a rectangle texture. And also it's a good workflow to get in if you're doing anything with games, because games will always prefer square textures. So what we'll need to do is also you'll notice I've stitched a few of the shells together. So like before, this was like separate shells that was split along these edges, and when unraveling them, unwrapping them, the seams were the same, so I'm able to stitch them together with no problems. And as I remember earlier at the start of this tutorial, when I UV'd the middle of the bone, there was like some compacting in the middle and they were overlapping in the middle. Now I'll split them off, and now you can see that the UVs at the top have this bend, and you can imagine if you pulled this bend down, that would crumple the UVs at the top, and that's why we're getting that crumpling effect. So this is a case where you have to separate the UVs into two shells in order to stop it from overlapping. But now we've got all the shells, what I'll do is I'll select all the UVs and I'll run this align command, or you can go polygon align, and you can choose different options, or there's a few other ones in here. So there's layout as well. Sorry, we want to use layout actually. So what we can do in here is we can choose like pre-scale, so we don't want to scale these, so we'll put that to none. We don't want any overlapping objects because we want them all to be separate, so you can change some options in here, but I'll just use the default with no sort of scaling, and it doesn't matter if they rotate either. So we'll just let that run through. Okay, so now it's aligned them to the best it can figure out. So what we'll do is select all these UVs, and now we'll place in the center of this UV texture square, and we'll just scale these UVs down. Now for this actual bone, it doesn't matter where the UV shells are for me, because all we'll be doing is texturing in Mudbox, painting over this, and it'll just have a texture over it. So it doesn't actually matter where the shells are. It doesn't matter that this seam here is up along some seam that might be somewhere else on the bone. It doesn't matter. The only place it might matter is if you're doing something for games or animation, where you're wanting this and then you're wanting some animated texture over the top, so like some glow that comes from the bottom and goes down. For that you'd want them in a certain order, but for this it doesn't matter too much. But what we want to do is, we've got these in a nice arrangement, but what we want to do is separate them up a bit and try and take as much space up as we can, and leave we don't want many gaps, because the gaps mean wasted texture space. And also what we'll need to do is, in between these, we'll need to leave a big enough gap for something like Mudbox, because usually what it'll do is when you paint on the texture, it actually overlaps. So if we had the texture painted already, what it'll actually do is have the diffuse of what you've painted on the actual UVs, and then there'll be a slight spillage over the UVs. So if we have two UV edges quite close to each other, that spillage will spill onto the other UV shell, and that'll cause some weird results like some seams, and you don't really want that. And also to note that you don't want anything to go outside this square, because essentially the square texture will take up from 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 in the X and Y. So if you have something coming over the edge, essentially this texture square here will repeat. So anything that goes over the edge here will actually be getting texture information from the other side. So you'll want to keep it inside this square. So what I'm going to do now is just rearrange these into a better order, and we'll export into Mudbox. Okay, so now that we've got the UVs set up for this bone, the one last thing we'll need to do before exporting it to Mudbox is delete the history and freeze transformations. Now the reason we delete the history is because doing all those tweaks with the UVs adds the history to a lot. Just adds and adds and adds up. So that history starts to lag Maya, and it has a chance of crashing, and also you don't want that history messing about with anything else. So it's like if you're using it for an animation, there's going to be deformers, your mesh might be moving. Having any history on the UVs is going to affect that, and you don't really want it. So all you'll have to do is go to Edit, Delete by Type, and History, and that deletes history on the selected object. And also what I want to do is freeze transformations, so Modify, Freeze Transformations. And the reason we're doing this is just so there's no transforms. So if we move this bone about and we want to get it back to the centre, all we need to do is set it back to 0. So we don't have to remember any numbers. Okay, so now if we want to export it, I'm going to be exporting this as an OBJ. So first off, what we'll need to do is go to Windows, Setting and Preferences, and Plugin Manager. And inside the Plugin Manager, what we'll need to make sure is we've got OBJ Export loaded. So if we don't have this loaded and we go to export, there's going to be no OBJ option. So we'll need this ticked, and if you're doing this a few times, you might as well have it auto-loaded so it's always on. So with it selected, all I'm going to go is File, Export Selection. All we'll do is we'll navigate to the folder that we're going to be using and give it a file name. So in this instance I've got a setup file name. So, and also I'll put from Maya. So this way I know that I've been sent an OBJ file format without the UVs. So I know this is the one from Maya with the UVs, and then if I export anything from Mudbox, I'll know that the one with from Mudbox is from Mudbox. So it's just a way of keeping a track on things. So all we need to do now is just hit Export Selection. And now it's exported that, and it's also exported like the shader with it. So now what we'll do is we'll go inside Mudbox and paint the textures on it. Okay, so once we're in Mudbox, all we need to do is File, Import, and we'll just navigate to the folder that it's in. So there we go. And also, as we named it earlier, we know exactly which one. There's only one in this folder at the moment, but if you have working on quite a few things and it's going to Mudbox, from Mudbox, and so forth, you want to know where it's come from. So we know this one's come from Maya. So we'll just open that. And again, because this is got quite a large poly count, it's going to take a while to import. If this was like a game prop or something for animation, it won't take as long. Okay, so now the bone's loaded in, and there's a few things we'll want to do before we actually start painting. And one thing we'll want to do is inside the image browser, we'll want to navigate. There seems to be some sort of a lag. Okay, I'll do that in a minute. For some reason it's not loading up. But what we'll also need to do is, for this particular bone, we'll have to take into consideration the type of pictures we'll be using. For this we've got photo references, and it depends on how the photos have been taken, because you could be using a normal camera, low budget camera, expensive camera, could have a lens, could be a macro lens, and all that can change the way that the photo's taken. It can bend around the actual side of the photo and it might not match up. So it always depends on how the photo's actually been taken. And for the photos that have been done for this, what I like to do is go down to the camera properties and switch to orthographic. Now that doesn't seem to be a big change when I've ticked from orthographic. So if I rotate it around and then switch, we can see that there's a shift in the actual perspective of the object. So that's perspective view and that's orthographic. So it sort of flattens the actual bone out. Now for painting the textures for the photos that I've got, this actually helps quite a lot, because with the orthographic, if we align the texture up, this end of the bone is sticking over and warped and it's not matching up with the texture. But once we switch to orthographic, it matches up a lot better. And another thing you want to do is go to properties, or preferences, sorry, and inside the camera, the default is default camera navigation. So if I set that to default, that's the same as Maya, where you can hold Alt and left click dolly left and right and rotate around the object. Now this is best for like if you've been using Maya and it's best if you're doing like game props or things like that. It's quite easy to texture, but because we want to align this object to textures, which we're going to use as a projection, it's better to use a tracker ball, because at the moment, holding Alt and left clicking to drag, if I want this object to rotate around this pivot going down the centre, so if I want this end of the bone to face me, it's quite hard to get that. We can get it by rotating that way, but we can't rotate it around now. You can only rotate on a few axes. So if we switch that to trackball, now what we can do is we can actually select with this angle. Before we couldn't rotate it around, now we can rotate it around that axis, and it just makes it quicker for setting up these photo references. Now this isn't the best way for the majority of texturing. You usually use a default, but for this it works quite well. Okay, so now we're in the image browser, and apologies for earlier on. There seems to be a problem with the recording program and bringing up this image browser window. So once inside the image browser, you can choose your destination or navigate to your folder. So what we'll do here is I will open up where I have the files, and usually what you'll best thing to do is have your source images in your source images folder, but for this, because I'm doing several different bones in individual bones, what I tend to do is keep the textures with the actual bones files themselves. So inside here I've got all the images that we'll be using, so I'll choose this folder, and down the left here you can see the images what we'll be needing to paint. So first off, we'll select one of these images, and you can hold Alt and right click in here to zoom out, just to get a preview of that image. And what we'll be doing here is we'll be taking this image and using it as a projection, or what we'll be using in Mudbox is called a stamp. So what we can then do is up here where there's these little boxes, we can use these for different things, like use it as a paintbrush, use it as a image plane, but for this we'll be using it as a stamp, so this little S icon. So we'll click that, and you'll notice down here in the right, in the properties, the stencil, sorry, not the stamp, the stencil properties, you can see the image there, so we know the image has gone across the stencil. So now in the 3D view, in the paint section, we'll be using a projection, and because we have that stencil selected, okay, apologies again, I just had to stop the video there because again there's a problem with the recording software and it's not allowing the stamp to load up. So now that we've got the stamp loaded up, we select the projection tool. There's a few shortcuts. Is Q, and that's to switch this on or off, so or you can tick the box here in the bottom right hand corner. So Q is to hide the actual stamp, the stencil, sorry. Now if we've got it hidden like so and we start painting, it's not going to take it into effect, so it disables it in an effect. Also if you hold down S and left click and drag, that's to rotate, right click is to scale, and middle mouse click is to move, and that's all whilst having S hold down. So what I'll first do here is I'll move this to the side and I'll just match up where it is. So I can tell that this area here is this top area here, so I'll just visually by eye map this up, and this'll take a while, and because I'm recording I'm doing this quite quick, but it's best to take some time and match this up perfectly, and especially for this type of job where it's archaeology, because these holes need to match the actual mesh of the object. When it's for game objects or animation, it doesn't have to be as accurate. So once we've got something looking like we want, what we'll do is we'll left click, and that will bring up paint new layer. Because we haven't got an actual paint layer done, we need a layer in order to paint onto. So for this I'll select the size, and you can name it if you want, and also the image format. So I'll set this to TIFF, and also the channel. So if you're doing diffuse, specular, so for this we want the texture of the bone, so we're going to use diffuse. If you use specular, you can actually paint the specular on, or bump map, things like that. If you paint on the bump map, it starts to paint a bump. So for this we'll just use the diffuse, and click OK. And what this will also do is, now if we save this file, it'll also save this paint layer. So any textures we make, when we save this file, this Mudbox file, it'll create a folder with the textures in it. So sometimes you don't actually need to export anything from Mudbox, you just need to save it and the textures are already there. Now with this projection tool, we can hold down B and left click and drag, and that will change the radius of our brush, and also M will change the intensity. So you can see that bar going up and down. So now all we need to do is left click and paint. Now you can see it's painting that texture on quite nicely. And again, because this is a tutorial, I'm going over quick, but what I would do is zoom in, paint one section, make sure all these holes line up with the indentations on the actual bone, and then go over and paint the next section. But for this we'll just do a quick job, and you can see we've now painted that texture. But one thing to note though, using the projection, is as it's projected from this angle it looks fine, but as you look from another angle it's stretched on these flat edges. So there's some problems with it, and what you'll need to do is take this angle and then paint over those areas. So it's something to keep in mind. So again, I'll just select another image in the image browser, and we'll just select, I'll show you one of the long bones for this. So we'll set this to stencil again, and you can see it updating in the corner. Go back to the 3D view, holding S, and using the mouse buttons we can align this again. And we'll look for landmarks, like we can see this C88 and this big crease over here. So what we'll do is we'll then align this up so we can see that C88 should be on there. And again, as I said earlier, it depends how the pictures are taken. If the camera's got some distortion, if it's a macro lens. Usually if it's a macro lens, it tends to bend things that are further away from it. It focuses on the closer objects, so sometimes the texture in the middle might match up perfectly, but as it gets towards the edge it might distort slightly. So it's always best to not do it from one angle. It's best to match up the middle, paint the middle, match up the sides, paint the sides, and match up these sides. So you can see it's already quite hard to match up the entire object, because as soon as you match up this side it's going to affect this side as well, and this might be slightly out. So you're never going to get it 100% perfect, and sometimes you can't, depending how the photos are taken. So again, that looks quite nice. So we'll go ahead and we'll paint inside these. And again, down here you can choose your different options for anything you want, but for this we'll just use the normal paint, and we'll paint that over the top. So with that, just using one tool, the projection tool, we can quite nicely and quite quickly get a detailed texture on this bone. And again, because I'm just recording this, I'm doing it quite quickly, but in actual fact what you would do is go over in detail each section of this bone. So you do this, match this up with the holes perfectly. And another thing to note is when you're matching up the holes, if I look at this I can see, right, there's some decay around here, and that quite matches up that area, and that looks alright from this angle. But then you can turn off the paint layer by clicking this little dot here and hide the paint layer, and all of a sudden you can see that some of these holes aren't matching up, because before we were using the texture painted from a different angle, from this angle, as a reference, and you don't want to do that, because some of the diffuse painted from this angle will be stretched and painted wrongly, but it'll be fine up here, but when it gets towards the edge it'll stretch. So when you use it here, if you use that texture as a reference, it's going to be wrong. So then the next texture you paint will be wrong. And then if you use that as a reference, the offset will add up. So always remember, just switch off the actual texture and align it to the actual mesh. Okay, so I'm just going to pause this video and go out throughout this board, and then we'll go on how to export this, and maybe I'll stop a few times and bring up a few points. Okay, so another point I'll just bring up is, whilst painting this bone, as you can see, if that's the C88 from that angle that I painted down, and as you can see, as it curves round, it starts to stretch, because this is where it gets to the side, so it starts to stretch down this face here. So whilst texture painting this angle, which is about there, so when painting this, what you want to know is the same will happen if I paint from here and go all the way up to the top. As it gets to there, it's going to stretch, and that's going to be stretching over pre-existing texture that I've already painted, which you don't want to do, because then you'll have to go over it again. So when painting, what I'll note is round about this area, that's not stretched, so I don't need to paint on that. But as it starts to get stretched down here, that's where you need to paint. So instead of painting everything on this side now, what you'll actually do is leave this top section, which is projected from above and isn't stretched, and then just blend into this new texture. So where it's stretched here, what I'll then start to do is blend this new texture in to about there, and then do the rest of this around here. So now the top part where it used to get stretched now blends into this side, and then you'll do the same from the bottom and all the way around. So that's the way to try and cover up some of the stretching. Okay, so now as you can see, I've textured the entire bone and got rid of the stretching around the edges by painting from a different angle. And another thing you'll want to watch out, there aren't so many in this particular bone, but some objects you might get different parts occluding another, and when you use a texture it might have a shadow, so if you paint, you might be painting on a shadow, so you want to avoid painting on shadows because that'll just leave a black spot. And another thing to take into account is when you take the pictures, you'll need to take the pictures at the same exposure, same light settings, because if you don't, for instance, you might have one angle like this might be quite light, and then you might take another angle and it could be darker, and the bone's the same, but when you paint it, one will be darker, and that could cause someone to think that there's a reason that that part of the bone's darker. And for this being like a medical reference for leprosy, if a part of the bone's darker, there's going to be a reason for that darker. Like some of these areas where there's the bone that's decayed, there's a reason why it looks like that, so you want to keep that in mind as well. So to actually export the textures for this, all I usually do is just save the file, and then when we go inside the actual file where we've saved it, you'll see there's a file that's created. So I've just named this O1, so it's made a folder O1 files, and inside here is going to be the actual texture that we painted. So for the actual textures, all we need to do is just save the file and it'll create the textures there, and now I can copy this, use it in Photoshop, and what I'll be doing is taking this back into Maya and just applying it as a texture. So there you go, that's how you can use Maya and Mudbox to set up some UVs and texture objects using photo references. I hope this has helped you, and if you've got any questions or any comments or anything about the videos, just leave a comment below and I'll try my best to answer it, and if you've got any problems I'll try my best to try and solve them. Thanks for watching.